president of the organization, the executive director for the museum. Also with us today is my colleague, one of our officers, Richard August, who's a docent here as well. So he and I are kind of going to trade off. So we formed originally as a state chartered militia. Militia has a very negative connotation in modern political terms. So when you hear people, Americans hear the word militia, they immediately assume right-wing, anti-government stuff, and that's not what we're about here. We celebrate the American tradition of militias, right? So these are citizen soldiers. Every town and village in New England would have a militia. And for a lot of our American history, it was compulsory that you would serve. When you reached a certain age, you would enlist in your local town militia. You would train in the town square, once or twice a week, practice to be a soldier, and you would be called on by your state government, your local town, the federal government, to protect your town or your state in times of war. And before the American Civil War in the 1860s, we had no standing army, basically. We had a very, very tiny, small army, literally 10 to 12,000 soldiers. And so in time of war, they relied on these militias to serve. And our museum is kind of celebrates that tradition, these citizen soldiers. Almost everything you see in our museum is directly tied to our little state of Rhode Island, small state in the country. We're about the size of a county in most other states. But it's rare to see so much material that's tied together through families, histories, through our local towns. And we know who carried a lot of these objects, who used these things, and that allows us to tell some really neat stories. So we started as state charter militia. We raised the money and largely physically built this building ourselves between 1913 and 1914. We leased the building to elements of the Rhode Island National Guard. I assume Australia, does it have a National Guard, some sort of Home Guard? Is it always like a federal level? National?
We just have reserves, which can be
We get part-time, and so if they call and there's something going on, we have reserves.
I got it.
Yeah, so they're not full-time.
Yeah. So we had state National Guard units that operated out of here with us. And this building has always been a function place. So for 120 years, there have been trade shows, parties, dinners of all sorts, corporate meetings, government meetings. It's been used for everything you can think of. And so it's not surprising that, any activity in the building is not necessarily military activity. On the lower level, just down the staircase there, 20 feet from this level, and you would hear heavy box sounds being slid across the floor. It's not just like a heavy cardboard box being dragged on the floor. And your first instinct is, who's here? Who is that? It's so loud and so obvious. Then when you come in and turn here or on below, you look at security footage, you see nothing. A couple of stories of more of the bigger things that have happened. We were returning chairs from downstairs in this room. We were stacking them along the wall here. So we were coming in through that doorway where you see the exit sign on my right. This was dark. We had two different guns here. And one of my colleagues, who was a combat veteran, never had a paranormal experience in his life. He was ahead of me carrying chairs into here. I came in behind him 10 seconds later, and he just was totally petrified. And he's like, look at me, and he had goosebumps all up and down his arms, and his hair was standing up, and I'm like, what's wrong? He's like, I just saw a ghost. I'm like, what? He's like, I just saw a figure appear here, he said, and basically walk in this direction like this. From one gun about the time I got here, just vanished. And he said he could see from the waist up, he could not see the legs, and he said the part that bothered him the most was the arm swing did not match the speed as the person moved across. He said that really creeped him out. And I could just tell by his genuine reaction that he saw what he saw. And I said, what did he look like? And he said he was short and had comb back slick hair, He had a short sleeve, button-down shirt with a wide open collar, and he was just like this. And he named to a T Major Jim Wilson, who was a retired major in the Army, and he was a caretaker here. He was very curmudgeon-y. He was kind of hunched over like this, and he literally lived in a closet in the back room, a little shower back there. He lived in the building for like 30 years. And he was the caretaker, and he passed away right when I came. I had only seen him around town, I didn't really know him at all. And Tim, I never met the person. Tim's not from around here. I had no idea the description is exactly this guy. He always wore these button-down, short-sleeve, nippy shirts with these big collars. And so we think he's one of the people that's around here. We've got him on EVP, but we've asked for his name, he's responded. I'm going to tell, sorry, I'm going along.
Tell them about the mushrooms you guys ate before that.
Yeah. Right. We've had, so one of my favorite stories is related to Jim Wilson. So when I first started here 11 years ago, there was an even bigger American flag, a modern nylon flag just hanging in front of all of this here, it's giant. Behind the flag, glued onto the wall, was this little faux wood plaque. And it said, flag gift of Major Jim Wilson. He bought this flag, donated to the Varnums, and he himself made a plaque to show that he had given it as a gift.
Yes, you did.
And it was behind the flag, and I'm like, this is ugly. And I literally peeled it off the wall. I'm by myself, and I chucked it down in the basement. No one noticed. It's behind the flag. No one ever sees it. And 2 years after I did this, I had 2 younger women come in for a tour. Not my usual clientele for a military history museum. And I'm doing my thing. We're walking around, and they start acting uncomfortable and like looking at each other and like just. I could tell they weren't really paying attention to my stories. And I'm like, I finally had to stop and say, "Is there something wrong? Like, you guys seem like you're upset about something." And they look at each other, and one nods, and the other says, "Well, we have abilities. We can see things that other people can't see." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm very open to that. Can you tell me what you're seeing? I'd love to know what you're picking up." And we kind of walk around. It was interesting. But what really got me is at the end of the tour, as we're walking out of the building, I said, "Yeah, I'm new here, and I'm making a lot of changes, and a lot of the old timers don't like those changes." And one of them goes, "I know. He wants you to put the plaque back on the wall." And she drew it with her fingers, like the shape. I even get goosebumps now when I say it. And that, absolutely freaked me out. I have no idea how that could possibly be done, other than it's true that they really have this ability. They don't know these people. They've never been in the building before. They live kind of far away. They don't know who Jim Wilson is. They don't know about this plaque that was given in the 1970s, and that I had taken it down 2 years before. You know what I mean? And so that really blew my mind. It made me more of a believer in people who claim to have those abilities. And often on our tours I'm shocked at the number of people who have come out and said, "I have an ability, I can see things that you can see, or I'm psychic, or what have you." And sometimes it's like, and then other times they say things that are like, "How do you know that?" kind of thing. They are, for people that are into American Civil War history, they're very famous and known all over the world. This cannon here is known as the Gettysburg gun, and it belonged to Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. Battery B, in a battery of artillery, you had 6 of these guns. And there would be about 100, 120 Rhode Islanders in the battery, and about 100 horses that served in the battle. At the Battle of Gettysburg, this is the biggest battle in the American Civil War, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, right in the middle of the war. The Confederate Army, General Robert E. Lee, invades into Pennsylvania, into the north. The 2 big armies collide at the small little town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in south central PA. And about 170,000 Americans fight each other over 3 days, just epic in scale. And by the end of that fight, there's 51,000 killed, wounded, or missing. It's hard for us to imagine those numbers, particularly given how small our population was back then. And Battery B arrives on the battlefield on day 2, July 2nd. The main Federal infantry from the north is behind the stone wall face to the west. Battery B gets thrown 150 yards in advance of their infantry, placed perpendicular to it. They're totally exposed. They have very little infantry support. They knew they were going to get attacked. And they're firing their cannons at a rebel battery to the north. So they're firing away, and the battery commander, Fred Brown, looks to the west, to his left. And on the horizon, he sees a large body of troops appear on the horizon. And they all think it's their support to come help protect them. It wasn't. It was 1,200 Howling Georgians of Wright's Brigade from the south. And they quickly close the gap. They start firing on Rhode Islanders. It becomes hand-to-hand combat. About half of the horses in the battery are shot down. Several men are shot down. The Gettysburg gun is captured by the Confederates, and it would be later returned to the battery that evening. And they would live to fight on that third day of the battle. On the third and final day, July 3rd, the Confederates decide to attack the Federal center of the line. The rebels were going to attack right where Battery B was located. In preceding this infantry assault, they had massed 150 cannons across a 2-mile front. And at 1 p.m. on July 3rd, these guns just start firing repeatedly. No one knows for sure how long, about an hour and 40 minutes is like the best guess. And it was described as the loudest event in human history at this point in time. They could hear the cannon fire 35 miles away in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The men talked about how the ground literally was shaking beneath their feet. Battery B, during this cannonade, begins to return fire. In manning the gun were these, more than just these three, but these three were here. William Jones is the number 1 man. He's standing there. He's the guy with the big rammer to load the charge. Alfred Gardner, the middle guy, he's in his mid-40s. His men teased him, called him Grandpa. He was very good-natured about it. He's a very religious man, and in the pocket of his coat, at this moment, he has a little Bible with his name embossed on the cover, Alfred G. Gardner. And in the margins of the pages of this Bible, he writes little messages to his 5 children, words of advice, words of wisdom, really emotional, charged stuff. He has 5 kids at home, and his wife's name is Adelia. And so he had that in the pocket of his coat. He's the number 2 man. He's standing here. He's the guy that loads the gunpowder and the cannonball into the tube. And then John Green was behind the axle on that side. Alfred takes a shell, bag of gunpowder and cannonball, solid shot, and he's taking it and he's turning to put it into the tube. But before he gets there, a Confederate shell from a mile away arches over the battlefield and smacks the muzzle. You see the dent. That shell explodes. It decapitates William Jones, instantly kills him, throws him several feet forward with a gun. Alfred, the older guy in the middle of the Bible, has his left arm severed, gets a gaping wound in his rib cage, and he ends up laying against this wheel. He's still conscious, but he's bleeding to death. And he's laying there with his one remaining arm outstretched. His best friend, his tent mate, was Albert Strait of West Greenwich, Rhode Island. Albert was the sergeant of this gun. Albert says he immediately goes to Alfred, and he grabs Alfred's hand, and he said the first words out of Alfred's mouth was, "Please tell my wife I died happy. Please, please make sure she gets my Bible." And Albert says they're under fire. He doesn't take the Bible right away. He bids farewell to Alfred. He says he turns his back and he hears Alfred yell out in a loud and clear voice, "Glory be to God, hallelujah, I am happy, amen." And then he would bleed out moments later and die. Albert, determined to fire this gun, picks up the charge that Alfred had dropped, separates the gunpowder from the solid shot round wall. They get the powder down the tube, takes the solid shot, that's the solid shot. He has a guy holding it here. Albert takes the yells for an axe, and he takes the backside of the axe, and he's trying to pound the cannonball down the tube, but because of the dent, it becomes stuck, exactly as you see it. and the tube would cool over time and become permanently fused to that cannonball. So that is a violent moment frozen in time from July 3rd, 1863. Now, as Albert's doing this, a shell would strike the axle. You see the damage. Another shell would come in from the side, blow out the spoke, slam into this cheek piece, the side of this. When you go around, you'll see the battle damage. It throws the gun up on one wheel, and at this point, they're like, the gun's disabled. They announce that it's out of service, and they leave it. Eventually, they would repulse this attack. It becomes a big victory for the North. On July 4th, our Independence Day, they hold their position. They dig a hole in front of their battery, and they begin to wrap William Jones and Alfred in a red blanket to bury them in this one hole. And it's at this moment that Albert remembers the Bible. And I don't know if he couldn't bring himself to go to his friend and pull it out of his pocket, but he asked one of his men to go take the Bible out. We have the Bible downstairs on display. You see it? When you read the inscriptions, you understand why those were his dying words. And the last message he writes in the Bible is July 2nd, 1863, Gettysburg. It's the day before he dies. He says, "In battery, all ready for action. I am well in body, and my mind is clear about the future. The thought of heaven has cheered me on this march from Falmouth to Pennsylvania." And then he says, "Children!" exclamation point. "Always be of good cheer, and always do right. This is the wish of your father." And Albert would write a letter to his wife, Adelia, and he would send the Bible home to her. We have a letter from her where she refers to the Bible as a national treasure, a symbol of the sacrifice that Rhode Island makes in the Civil War. And one of the we've actually had a few weird synchronistic things happen with the story. So literally about 2 months ago at Brown University in their archives, a poem was found, a handwritten poem from 1950 that no one knew existed, written by Alfred's youngest daughter. 1950. And it was a poem about the Gettysburg gun and her father's service and his sacrifice. And so we're actually gonna do an event early next year, where we're gonna read that poem and we're gonna display it. Here's the other synchronistic thing that happened. So we know from letters that Alfred wrote to his wife, Adelia, that he would often pick wildflowers along the march and at battlefields. And he would pick the flowers. In the letter, he would say the date and location of where he picked them, and he would fold them up and mail them to Adelia. We just knew that from the letters. We share these stories on Facebook and Instagram. And a couple of years ago, an active duty Army officer from Maryland messaged me on Facebook, and he says, "Hey, I've got something you're gonna want related to this story." I'm like, "Okay." And I met him down in Gettysburg, and he walked up to me and gave me a box, and inside was a little black ledger book. And open it up, and written inside the cover, it says Adelia Gardner, 1870. And like my heart skipped a beat. And then on all of the pages are all of the wildflowers that he had mailed home to her.
Oh.
She had pasted in this book, and she carefully recorded the date and location. And we have it open downstairs to a particular page where it says June 22nd, 1863, Falmouth, Virginia, and she writes the last.
Oh.
Yeah. And, it's weird too that it'll be in spurts. We've had things like for a month or two, there'll be like repeated things every week where it'll happen in different of our doses. And then we'll go 6 months and like nothing happens at all.
Or nobody's here at the time that it happens.
Right.
But
You just don't know.
It's a sliver of time,
Yeah.
you'll be there at the right time.
Yeah. So that's the Bible, by the way, up in the center of that case, and then the flowers are on the other side where she's looking. You can see Alfred's name in the Bible. It's very fragile. Eventually, we're going to digitize all the inscriptions.
You made a book out of it.
Document conservatory.
Done by our document conservator. It's,
Yeah.
It's a little custom-made book cradle.
Yeah, I used to do it, I found it too.
What was that?
But
But they do a lot of damage
Oh,
to you.
yeah.
Oh, wow.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So,
They break ribs and they.
Tear your, like
Yeah.
something like this will tear your arm or leg right off.
Oh, no
So
doubt.
I'll tell the shorter version of this story. So this is Fred Brown. This is the guy who commanded the Gettysburg gun. He was at Gettysburg as the commander. He's on horseback. That's a picture of Fred. He's very short. He's up on a platform, mind you. Based on his uniform, we think he's 5'0"
Wow.
Very short. So short that when the war broke out, he tried to enlist in the infantry, and they're like, "You're too short." Even back then, when most people were a lot shorter than they are today. Undeterred, he ends up in the artillery. He has very strong leadership skills, and he quickly rises to command that Battery B. Remember, I said they arrived on the second day of the battle, and they were way out in front, and they got hit by these 1,200 howling Georgians of Wright's brigade. Well, he led the battery back to the stone wall to safety, about 150 yards to the right. And at that position, there's a gap in the stone wall where he was able to roll his cannons through and save his battery from annihilation. And if you go to Gettysburg National Military Park today and you stand on that spot, the stone wall ends in that very spot, and the park rangers refer to it as Brown's Gate in honor of Fred for saving his battery from annihilation.
So where were they with Gettysburg? I'm trying to
Yeah,
memorise.
it's
We've just
yeah?
done the
So that's South Central Pennsylvania.
No. We were at the, I went to all the battlefields, each section, and looked at all the monuments and all that.
So this
stuff.
is Cemetery Ridge. Do you remember the carrot horse? And so just remember that. Anyway, 30 years after the battle, veterans returned to Gettysburg to plan the national park. And as you know, there's these monuments everywhere. In order for a regiment or a battery to have permission to put a monument
Yeah,
in the
that's
spot,
probably interesting to know that.
you had to get 2 other units to agree that you were indeed in this position. Because people were always trying to be the furthest out front. And so Wright's brigade, these rebels at the Battle of Bull Run, first major battle, he was shot to the head. Standing behind him was Private William Lloyd wearing these cotton gloves, and he cradled Prescott in his arms. There's 2 accounts that he did this. Lowered him to the ground. He was the first guy in their company to be hit, and the entire company froze in shock. And he lived for a few seconds. He said, "I'm sorry, boys, I'm going." And he died. And anyway, the officers were yelling at the men to keep going because they're so under fire. And one of the officers wrote after the battle that the men eventually regained their composure and were seen loading their muskets with tears streaming down their cheeks over his loss.